Welcome aboard the dopamine train, where our ADHD-powered locomotive stops at every shiny thought along the tracks. I'm Obee Won, and with my co-host Rome, we explore various topics and see where the conversation train takes us.
Welcome to podcast episode number 3 with myself and Obee Won, tuning in for another discussion of various topics, starting off with one that I find pretty intriguing. And I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on this, or what your intention was when you brought it up. And that is intent versus impact. Obee Won, how are you doing today?
Doing well, Rome. Doing well. Yeah, I think intent versus impact is one of those things and concept that impacts our everyday lives, from our personal life to our professional life, relationships, and everything that we do. So, to get into it a little bit, intent versus impact. So, one example I think of, as we said on a previous podcast, I am an educator working in higher education. And what I work on with my students is this very concept. They are student leaders, and what it comes down to is the bureaucratic leadership skills of, like, from running a meeting to asking for help for work and things of that sort. So we'll pop into one example where I had a president of a club wanting to delegate more of their tasks to eBoard. And so one intent of doing that was like to lighten the load, right? That's the intent. But the impact of that was other people have to do work, and other work that they previously may not be trained on, this and that, or may not even take to. So that's one intent versus impact example, kind of very broad a little bit. And also the other one I'm thinking of in terms of examples is another student leader working with first year students. So their whole thing was helping them acclimate to college. And so realizing that their intent might be good and just of, like, inviting themselves along, but were you asked? And the impact could be negative of not being wanted there. And so your intent was all good and hearty and trying to show them the way, but it wasn't asked, and the impact is actually negative. So that's, like, kind of the paint of the picture, little bit of intent versus impact. What are your thoughts, Rome?
So
intent versus...
this idea, is this the same thing as ends justifying the means, or ends not justifying the means?
Kind of. So your ends, right, or mean. So the means would be, let's do it in terms of like a business transaction, right? When, let's say we're in a restaurant at McDonald's. You ordered that good old $5 meal that gives you the McChicken, McDouble, 4 nuggies, fries, and a drink, right? Your intent maybe was to be kind to the person at the register taking your order, but by your intent of trying to get your order right, you're a little rude, and the impact is negative. So then that person's like, oh, they said this in this way, they're being a difficult customer, but in reality, you're just asking for what you want at the end. And so it's not like, just because when I hear justify ends the means, right, is like, I can be rude, I need to be direct to get what I want, but the unintentional consequence or impact, right, is that you're not going to get what you want. They're just thinking that, oh, this is a person that's being difficult, right? And it doesn't matter as long as I push out their food in a timely manner, make sure by the time they talk to me at the speakerphone and they're at the window at the front, and if I'm under a minute, we're good, and my manager won't yell at me. That's what matters. Does that make sense?
It does. And it begs the question, do you think that, so it requires some level of self-awareness in order to recognize these things, in order to look back on a situation and go, oh, maybe I was a little bit rude there, or that person was acting a certain way because maybe something happened to them throughout the course of their day. Do you think that is something teachable? Like you can make people aware of their own state of being? Or do you think that is a quality that people intrinsically have or develop as a result of their brain or their personality? Because I've found in the past, there are many instances where you'll talk to someone about the various situations they've been in that seem to have a consistent theme. Like they're the common denominator of the every single breakup that happens, or they're always having run-ins with certain people out in public, and they never seem to realize that there's a possibility they might be the cause for it. It's usually blame that is pointed back out into the world. So I just want to get your opinion on if you think that's a teachable skill or something that you either have or you don't, or it's acquired through experience or growth.
I'm always in the camp that it is teachable. But there's a factor in there, right? You can teach, but if the person doesn't want to be taught, that's another question. So it's like a two-part. Like part A, yes, 100% teachable. Part B, no, because it's dependent on the receiving end, right?
For sure.
Because what you described too is like, oh, this the common factor in that person's life is them. What I'm hearing is they're not self-reflecting. They're not looking inward. It is a very much a the world is imposing their will on me, and I am just not. I don't want to use this word because it gets used a lot as like victim, but that's the best way I could think of. Or I am I am receiving this as the consequence receiving person. But what I am challenging is the intent versus impact. Is the self-awareness is part of the intent in that whole process of self-reflection, right? When we're having a self-reflection activity of like, how did my day go, if I'm writing in a journal or meditating or being mindful and such, how could I have done this better? If people aren't having that conversation with themselves of like, how did I contribute? How did I do to this? Then it's already lost in translation, in my opinion.
How do they get to that point? I know it sounds like I'm repeating the question. Do we have any influence on that, or is there? Can you recognize the process or something that happens that makes the person go, wow, the last however long, 20, 30 years, I haven't been paying attention to anything I've been doing, and now I know it's actually been my decision making this entire time that's led to some of the negative consequences so far. Like, how do people get to that? And I understand if you don't know, because that seems like a very subjective or personal thing to go through. And I bet if you asked them and they told you, there's no guarantee that that would be the correct answer either. It's just based on a feeling. But do you have any thoughts on that?
I would say that it's kind of like Plato's allegory of a cave, right? Are we familiar with Plato's allegory of a cave?
Not familiar, no.
Okay, so Plato allegory of cave is this, that you have people in this cave that are watching the shadows play on the cave walls, and it looks so real and such that it is their reality of life. And Plato argues that it takes the person to turn and walk out of the cave to the reality of the light and what's the real world. And so the condition too is that that person, once they have exited, cannot enter back and try to convince them otherwise. So it's what you're asking in a sense is there a catalyst to this self-discovery that we as people can do to do this? By Plato's argument, no. On my argument, a little bit yes, a little bit no, because everything is a lot more gray as I've gotten older in the wisdom. Because of this, if you are a person that has this knowledge, it is establishing trust with that person. It depends on what rapport you have with them. And if you can have that honest conversation with them. And it's kind of a wisdom thing where I can talk with someone and like feel them out if they're talking at me. if they're just kind of life dumping on me. That person's not ready to listen to outside things, right? They are just there to life dump, hear me, and that's it.
Do you deal with that a lot? Have you gotten, I know some people have referred to it as trauma dumping, where you start a conversation and it just ends out to be a listening session?
A lot. I think it just. I don't think it's generational. To be honest, that's where I would say it is. You can have a 70-year-old person doing this. You can have a 20-some young adult person doing this, and you can have
Oh,
like
you're saying
us
everyone will do it.
Everyone does that. I don't think that's generationally tied.
Okay.
But the willingness to listen. I've worked in a variety of industries, as you've known, in a variety of different age groups and such. What I've discovered is it really is dependent on the work the person has done to improve their situation or to attempt to do so, right? If they are the train of woe is me, listen to me, woe is me, feel bad for me, do stuff for me, then it's not going to, their life's not going to change. I will say, granted, there are circumstances where that is appropriate and like there is a time and place for that, like loss of significant other, loss of family member, loss of like beloved companion animal, appropriate. At a certain point, though, what are you doing to do the work to get past it? It's like I think everyone nowadays, at least in our age group, is like therapy. Go to therapy. Go talk with a professional who is
Right.
equipped to help you guide. Right now, I'm very much an advisor. My advising style is with my students is asking questions for them to discover it for themselves. Not everyone's like that, but what I find with that style is in the long term it is more beneficial for them because they come to the realization themselves. We just got to get them realizing, right? So for it to bring it back full circle to your question, is it possible for us to do that? Is maybe asking the right questions, right open-ended questions is the way you could go about it. But I wouldn't do that unless the person you are talking to has rapport and is and you would say deem ready for a solution. But that's also like conversation skills of like I due to my social awkwardness, I literally ask, "Hey, is this event or is this a solution based?" And that has served me a lot in terms of those people who trauma dump or life dump on you. In the middle of it, I'm like, are we looking for solutions? Are we looking for event? And that kind of changes my mood of how we even continue the conversation, right? If they're listening, they need someone to vent. I'm here for that. Cool. We know what my purpose is in this situation versus if we're the opposite of looking for solutions, because I would say Rome and myself are very solution based people. We see the problem, how do we fix it? And that could just because of our upbringing, various things or whatnot, but that's how we are, but not everyone has that. So just bringing it full circle for the intention versus impact to get to that point, you can foster it through open-ended questions to getting into it, but it comes back to, is that person willing to listen?
You brought up a couple things that I think are important to hone in on. So it sounds like you're actually implementing strategies that a therapist would use, because I remember growing up and thinking that the solution to either my problems or my friends' problems would be to tell them what to do, because in my head I thought, and maybe I had a natural affinity towards coming up with the most sensible solution to an issue, whether it was some trivial relationship thing that was happening in 8th grade. But I ended up being the guy that people would ask for advice. And I imagine there's a lot of people who end up in this situation depending on their disposition and their personality. But I didn't know any better at the time, obviously, because I was a kid. But I thought if I just told everyone what they should be doing, or if they asked me and I explained the solution, that was the correct thing. And I ended up getting frustrated all the time because 99% of the time, people don't do those things. They're going to end up doing what they want anyway. And really, what they just wanted was for you to listen, or for me to listen to them. And I didn't understand this because I thought it was like a mathematical equation where you could plug in the appropriate answer and get what you desired. But really, it comes down to them independently coming to the conclusion of how they're supposed to move forward. And it sounds like in your own work, that's how that's how you are framing it, and that's your method for communicating with them, because they actually have to do it on their own. There was a second part there too, but I don't even remember anymore. But I think
The second part. I'm curious about the second part now. You've drawn me in.
Well, if it comes back to me, I'll bring it up. But it's essentially, yeah, I don't know. But having that ability to listen and only provide the response when it's either asked for, or it's clear that the person you're talking with is looking for, or a solution. Because really, people will start talking to you and it starts to derail them as soon as you reply. Like, they actually had no intent. Right. They think that they're telling you because they want you to give them the answer to the problem. And, sometimes they'll ask and maybe they'll listen, but most of the time they just want to hear themselves, which is perfectly fine, by the way, because it means that they trust you to confide this information. And to use an analogy of things getting bottled up, you want all of that to be healthily withdrawn in some way, shape, or form. And if it comes out through conversation, then more power to you. I think the real problem was when some people don't want to say anything at all.
Suffering in silence is what you're getting at.
Yeah.
Yeah. That happens, I think, a lot. I think it happens a lot more than it did 10 years ago, personally. It was still happening, but it's strictly opinion. I want to make that clear. But in terms of, again, I can only speak to the younger generation versus older. There's a couple things in play, and I can only speak to, again, like in terms of men and growing up as a man, of like, was feelings allowed to be talked about in your household? And if they were, what were the healthy outs that were given, if any, outs at all? I think that comes down to it too. Like, I grew up in a household where father kind of talked about feelings, but maybe not. But I knew it was okay, kind of due to religion socialization, because both you and I grew up in a Roman Catholic household, so we had priest, right? Going to that awkward...
And went to Catholic school.
Yep. Going to that awkward, like, confessional thing of, like, let me tell this priest who may or may not have the life experience to tell me anything solution-based or helpful in the situation of, like, sin or advice. You can tell where my opinions go for that based off my response. But bringing it back, I think it comes down to people are, if they're comfortable talking to feelings. And I think now versus then is we're so, due to COVID, hate using that, but it's like my go-to. I think everyone's go-to is there was a lack of socialization in a corporation of fear. If I interacted with someone in person, I might die. Right?
Yeah.
That was kind of like the vibe. And so what we're trying to do now as a society is come out of this, but also we're dealing with things that, in my opinion, are quite addictive and also do a very good job of holding our attention, right? And so to bring it full circle, I think that everyone should go out in their community, whether it be volunteering, whether it be a sport you like, or a hiking group, um, or a card game. I'm big on board. That's why I love board games, is because it puts you in person. And really practice those skills of conversation. Really practice those skills of like building relationships. I think it's a lost art. Now, granted, it does happen online. It happened when I was playing Overwatch because of the nature of the game and the team building. I am still online friends and good friends with those people to this day, and it's like when Rome and I meet up in California right after for a year, it's like we left off where we left off in 2008. Um, Not saying it's not possible. I think that there's an extra layer when it done in person.
I feel like that's kind of rare. Like you'll meet a few people here and there where there's no time lost seemingly after you start talking again after an extended period of time. Granted, you and I do keep up a little bit either in phone calls or well, doing this I think is a great way for us to keep up.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the time when you're away from someone for an extended period and you talk to them, there's this sort of rebuilding period that has to happen again. But for whatever reason, with certain friends, like for you and I, it's just like no effort. We hang out and it's like hitting the play button after it's been paused for 6 months.
Right, that old VHS tape that's like having the roughest time staying on because the electrical tube or fuse in the bag's about to go out.
There was something you said earlier. I want to talk about the relationship stuff, but before we go to that, I want to get your opinion on this. So I personally haven't gone to confession in, God, I don't know how long, forever. And it got me thinking about, because you mentioned the example of talking to a priest and they don't know really anything about you. And you are sharing some of your, depending on how honest you are, you're sharing some of your darkest secrets with them. Do you think from a non-religious standpoint, what you're doing, the art of confession, does that have real utility to it? Like, does it actually solve a problem temporarily, at least, if at all?
Getting at a good thing. It's kind of like the argument I make with therapists is you have to write, and doctors, and sort of in any sort of thing you need to better improve your life, you have to find the person for you. And you're like, but what do you mean? I'm like, for the only priest that I found throughout high school and throughout my experience in terms of Christianity, what that was decent and actually like didn't have this entitlement with him was the president of the college. Forget his name for me, but he was from Vietnam. He grew up during communism Vietnam. Talked about how he had a fiance, was about to get married, had relationships, like lived, had a life before, in his words, being called to God to service. And so I trusted his advice when it came to all the things and was honest about that because he was open and authentic about his context and his relationships and whatnot. But you have to find the right priest. You have to find the right pastor. And you may not vibe with each person. That's okay. Like, I've gotten very lucky in therapists that the first one I choose out of a hat has been a hit for the most part. There was a couple during college that I was like, you're not really helping me. But then it brings back the question, what am I doing to make this better, right? Because you can go to therapy and put out all your stuff and talk about your traumas and talk about your life and whatnot. But until you're willing to do the work, it's not going to change. And so, in a sense, you're getting that venting session. But in therapy, there's work that needs to be done, and you're in at least have the Yale College try. But that's where I found, to bring it full circle back to your question of, once I had a decent priest, I felt it to be helpful because I'm getting something that may have been internalized and not talked about with anyone, right? And so I'm a big person of, you don't let things bottle up inside so that it doesn't spill out in a intent versus impact conversation maybe, right?
Oh, you're giving me flashbacks. So
Well, flashbacks to what? I'm curious.
to, well, just my experiences with trying to find a therapist that works for me. And I mean, there have been instances where I've actually caught the therapist just straight up not listening, where
Oh
you're
my god.
talking and then you see their eyes kind of light up, but not in they heard you say something that stood out to them, but in oh, he stopped talking, so I need to listen and try to formulate a sentence that's related. So I've had that happen. And then this, surprisingly, you would think would be a compliment, but it's just not reassuring at all necessarily, is I've had a couple instances where therapists would say, you really seem like you've got things sorted out, or you would make a good therapist yourself. And I think, well, I appreciate that, but I don't feel like that right now. I kind of need you to help me.
Wild. That is wild, and I'm sure to our listeners have experienced that same thing. And that's where the empathy for my part comes in. Is like I've just lucked out, but also that's like it's like going to the doctor's like you're healthy enough. What? You
Yeah, like, oh,
don't need to see
we're
me.
not
Like
worried
what?
about you yet.
Like we're trying to do preventative more now. We don't want to be at the yet part now. What strategies can I put in place so I don't get there?
See, you
God,
got
that
to
is
have that Illuminati level insurance in order to get those perks of
not that
preventative maintenance.
Affordable Care Act thing from God. I think it's by state now or Cal. I don't know what it's called in California. I know it's like Medicare here. Is it Medicare out there? I'm very ignorant on that fact, even though I shouldn't be.
As long as you're able-bodied and ready to work, then you're healthy enough. Nothing else matters.
Right.
If a ticking time bomb is popping up down the line, that's not our concern right now. Just do your job
It's okay for the horde, right?
for the horde. Uh,
um, that's funny. I feel like you touched on something about that where it's also where I'm thinking about that for you empathizing is like maybe it's not covered by insurance and you're dropping like $200 a month so that like I don't know. I'm not to like sound dire or anything, so I'm just not going to off myself. Like this is the toll to pay in a sense, but even when I'm doing that, I'm not even getting that service. It's like bad. So, empathize with you 100% of that. I'm hoping that you've had a therapist since then that's worked. Maybe yes, no, Rome.
I have. I mean, it's partially my fault too, because some therapists. Well, I've only seen two therapists in my life, and the first one I
Okay.
stopped seeing because of I didn't. He was older too, so I guess it's partially
Mm,
understandable. But the gal I was seeing would give me work to do, and sometimes I would do it, and other times I wouldn't. So that's on me for not following through on
right.
that stuff. But I still think, going back to what you said, I just need to find the right person. And I haven't had time to,
Hmm.
that might be an excuse, but I don't think it's necessary for me right now. And it could very well in the future. Actually, I want to hear your opinion on this. Do you think seeing a therapist is something that you should do as a routine maintenance thing, or is it more important when something is actually going on and you should talk to someone?
I think that depends on the individual, and I hate to like been using that card over and over
No,
again,
it's all good.
individual person, because the more and more
Do you think it's
I continue in
redundant
the
to just go see someone when you're like fine?
depends on what you need, and
Yeah.
that's where like again you should explore with the therapist of what your needs are. Maybe you're the person like let's I hate to use this analogy, but I'm going to use it's like your car, right? So some people run the thing of I'm going to run this car until it don't run no more and not do any preventative maintenance for it and see how it goes. And you see those videos of like this person only had a quart of oil. That's why just decided to stop working or
Destroyed
things of
the
that
engine.
sort. Destroyed the engine. And then we're paying for it more in the front end in the back end, right? And so I would say that everyone should visit a therapist. I personally see one as a maintenance routine because I find in my own self reflection that I am less impulsive when I have someone to talk to. And so that to bring it full circle, as long as you have someone to talk to, that might be what works for you. But again, a therapist is ideally trained to have those conversations. And sometimes it to open up, not that we're anti-religion out here, but I know some pastors, priests, and whatnot do go through training for divinity school to have those conversations of counseling. And
Really?
so, yes, they
I didn't know
do.
that was a thing.
Yes, one pastor I talked to that went through that training, and that actually came from my mother was going to, again, Roman Catholic, was going to her friend's Bible study at a Baptist church, and the pastor was Baptist, and I actually talked to him a bunch when I was on vacation back in California on times, just to like go through spirituality, whether I wanted to subscribe to all the things Christianity, was this for me, this and that, do I want to subscribe to something that has a lot of drama associated with it? Uh, and that was one of the things that they were trained on in divinity school, was that. So it just depends, but it comes back to they're going to probably come from the guise of like, this is God's maybe thing. I've noticed with the younger, more modern pastors who I've actually worked with at school and college because of like interfaith work and such, they have gone through that training and are more like coming from a interfaith perspective a lot of the time, rather than, what's the word I'm looking for, a trying to convert you to the cause perspective. So hopefully that answered your question in an elongated way.
It did. Thank you for that. And I know that kind of moving along here, you wanted to talk about the idea of courting nowadays, and you briefly mentioned dating prior online and in regards to, it's funny. I would say that one of the best forms of therapy, for me at least, has been just not using social media at all for the past, I think it's been 3 months now since I got off Instagram and TikTok. And it's completely transformed my life, honestly, in a very simple way, too. It's just that all of the time and all of the thoughts that I had in regards to going on Instagram or thinking about sharing something there or seeing what other people were up to, I'm just not using that time for those things anymore. It's going towards either other interests or it's focused on my work and doing I find that I'm not constantly trying to look for ways to get out of whatever responsibility I have to do. The responsibility has actually become the central focal point, which I'm happy for. And hey, it may change down the line. I may decide to get back on. It isn't the first time that it's happened, but I haven't had any experience with online dating in years, over 5 years at this point.
Wow.
I should say dating in general. I haven't talked to anyone or seen anyone seriously in 4 years. So that's my bit. I kind of just let off with that, but
No, you're good.
I'm curious to know what you were thinking about when you decided, hey, let's talk about dating today. What was coming to mind?
I would say that it seems to be always the topic of like, relationships and personal relationships with significant others is always a big topic. And I was just curious, but I actually, based off your response, want to circle back to the main topic and get into the social media stuff because I find that a little bit more intriguing.
For sure.
Because I think it's related. And so you answered this question, like, do you find more time? You answered yes. And did you find that there was like a withdrawal a little bit? Because in my opinion, social media, technology, all the above, because it's shiny, bright lights, it's kind of you're entering the casino and getting drawn to the slot machine action. That's the same kind of feeling social media, I think, gives to a lot of people in society, and it's
Oh,
just not acknowledged or
absolutely.
talked about.
Right.
So,
That's so true.
did you find withdrawal? Is my first question from it.
Yes. Well, there's different points in time where I've decided to take a break from social media. And I would say it was a lot worse the very first time because Instagram in particular is such a integral part of my day-to-day being. Like I almost find it routine to pull out my camera, post something on my story, just because I'm that type of person where I have a thought
Right.
or a song that comes to mind and I immediately want to share how it makes me feel with other people, whether they care or not, but just instinctively I do. And I can cite that with other points of evidence too. Like, I did theater plays and I like doing video and I'm still on YouTube. Some people would consider that a social media, though I find that to be a lot less invasive than the other ones because the other ones portray themselves as being very casual and just off the cuff. Whereas YouTube, I think of as a commitment that I have to spend time sorting out outside
Right.
of post-production. I mean, obviously YouTube has its own caveats as far as roping viewers in. But I
Right.
know at the end of the day, especially with the type of content I watch, that I probably have learned some employable tools that I can use later. Whereas with
Right.
Instagram, it felt purely like a release of, if I felt some level of vanity, I could just share that
Ah.
instantly. Like, you got that gratification from it. Same thing with
Right.
TikTok as well. I think the difference with TikTok is that it was less personable than Instagram. So when Instagram started, it was not owned by Meta. And the idea was that you followed friends and family so that you could see the pictures they were up to. It was kind of an answer to
Right.
Facebook, which had become this very disorganized, overbearing system of timelines and
Oh my god.
photos and all sorts of things. And then eventually, Instagram turned into a business tool. I think it set the precedent for what people think of social media when it comes to influencers and posting selfies and getting lots of likes and views. And well, that's a bit of a separate topic, but as far as those numbers go, it had a really substantial impact on my mental health. And that's something that I didn't want to bring up for the longest time because it seems so superfluous. The idea that
Right.
a number associated with your content or what you post is just, it's nonsense. But I think more people are dealing with that than they'd like to admit. And I will say that if you're losing the game, if you decide to step out of it, that could be a form of winning in and of itself. So after I got off of Instagram, I was no longer able to see those numbers. And so they were no longer a concern. I noticed my anxiety decreased drastically. And it wasn't like anxiety of, oh, I've got a big meeting coming up that's kind of in the foreground of your mind. This was just a chronic background. It's almost like knee pain. If you ever experience some sort of
Mm-hmm.
injury that isn't brought on by, like an event that made it really bad, like breaking your arm or something. It's just an overuse type of injury. I had this chronic anxiety in the back of my head that was just always floating around thinking, well, my friend or this person that I know from school, they always get more likes than me, or they always seem to have more people engaging with. Am I just a dislikable person? And it was kind of ironic. I said this to my cousin the other day that the one person in the family who got into social media, like trying to build an online presence, trying to act in film and TV and grow a YouTube channel and all those sorts of things, is the one person who wasn't doing as well numerically as like my cousins who just effortlessly seem to get all sorts of engagement and things like that. Or, I have students now who are just, they're blowing up on social media, and it's not because they're trying to be influencers. They just have lots of friends and they're popular. And that gets, I'd be lying if I didn't say that got into my head a little bit as well. So I start to reflect and go, what am I doing wrong here? Obviously, I know from a logical perspective that there's lots of factors at play in algorithms and in how people meet and how they communicate online in different generations. And there are probably things that I could have done better, or, things that I've done well, but just haven't gotten the recognition that they deserve, or other people would say they deserve, because I have gotten that comment before of, how does this not have more likes or more engagement? But after removing that element, it just made things incredibly easy.
Right.
I don't want to trail off too much there in case you have questions, or if you have your own experience with that.
I would say what you touched on was it made me think of a couple things. Part of me wanted to maybe in our future episodes talk about the history of social media and these kinds of impacts, and maybe that's a better spot to do these questions. The other thing that it reminded me of what we talked about earlier in the podcast was like sharing your story brings back like the venting person. This is where maybe we should be talking to someone instead of putting it on social media. Maybe we're connecting with someone instead of putting it on social media. Granted, you can use electronic forms to connect with that person, and maybe that's the way you're doing it. But that key of venting person came to mind. The other part was the negative self-talk that I think encounters a lot because of it, because you're looking at others, and then by default, you have to look at thyself as like, well, what are the measures here of success? Am I hitting those measures? And it sounds like it wasn't a good spot for you, and it's hard, again, not speaking for you, but it seems like you were doing it in thoughts of like, this is my work. But what the growth spot for you, it seems like, was like, I'm going to do this regardless of whether I get likes or not, because I find joy in it, and that's why I should be doing it. And by removing this equation of the social media that is impacting this negative self-talk, I can still enjoy what I'm doing. And I applaud you for that, because people will sit in that for years and decades now, because that's how long social media has been now, is at least a decade, right? Plus. And so I applaud you for that. Turning away from the shadows and entering the light.
Ironically enough, I would say that the biggest motivations for switching were actual TikToks that I got on my feed saying like, you don't need to worry about the, yeah. And that's the double-edged sword. Yeah, that is the double-edged sword, because I already throughout my life have had a propensity towards content that is meant to be inspiring or motivational. So there were a lot of instances where that would pop up on my feed, and I would turn off the phone and I would go and do something. I don't think that's everyone's situation. Like, most people are getting some like skibbity toilet brain rot Fortnite edits, or
the sludge.
Yeah, they're getting, I mean, I get that stuff too, but they'll get something like, if there is an aspect of life that they're complaining about, maybe it's work related, they're probably getting videos of other people complaining about work. So you fall into this echo chamber of negativity, whereas I was in the echo chamber of positivity. So it was actually pulling me out of a hole.
So by
surprising.
Chance, the algorithm was in your favor.
It really was. And there, that was insidious too, because like some of the most inspiring pieces of content I've ever seen. In fact, I have two in my 5 years of being on TikTok. I have two of them that are saved on my desktop that I will click on and watch every once in a while, because I find them to be the most powerful. I mean, the entire idea of the AI bot on my stream that was someone who liked my video, and I liked their profile picture and took it, used it as his. And then I got a TikTok of an old Russian movie from the 60s or 70s. I think it was the 70s. And it just sparked my creativity for the idea. Like, there are bits and pieces in my films that come from TikToks that I watched, not directly, but they gave me the idea for it. So
Right.
I have to give it to TikTok specifically, because I think the algorithm is a little bit more aggressive, and the people
Right.
who post there are more willing to share things that, I don't know if it has to do with them being willing to share things, but on Instagram, you just get a bunch of like stale, washed. I don't know how to say it. I mean, there's some good stuff on Instagram, but TikTok is where you get like the cutting edge, most creative short form content creators. And then Instagram and YouTube are just, I don't know, they're not quite the
Just
same.
one's like the old guard of like seeing the new generation come in, right? And then the other one's like, oh, we're just kind of here. Um,
Yeah, we don't know what we were originally a photo sharing platform, but we're just trying to cash in on whatever application or technical trend is because that's what it comes down to. When TikTok first came about, the numbers that they were pulling in as far as hours watched were just unprecedented. It would have been
Wild.
very foolish for Instagram and YouTube to not follow suit. But from an audience member standpoint, it's just a subpar experience. I don't go
Right.
on YouTube because I want to watch shorts, or I don't want to be on Instagram so I could watch shorts. I want to see what other people are up to in my circle, but it's all so predicated on what is getting the most engagement and pushing that out as much as possible so more people see it.
Right. It's TikTok will forever be a conundrum for me a little bit, for the simple fact that it is just a Vine with music. And you had Vines, right? Are we familiar with Vine?
Yes.
Yes, no? Okay. For our audience purpose, Vine was a platform that you had like, I don't know, 10-second video, and they would just do a variety of things. That was the platform. And then they died off because it wasn't coming in, and so TikTok kind of reinvented this idea. I think if I was to opinion based off information gather, put something out there, is that TikTok saw something and said we could do it better. I don't think they were the only original thing that they saw was maybe that they had a wider audience to capture, because I know a lot of the social media at that time was just English based versus like international based, and so maybe TikTok said, "Oh, we could do that, and we could do it international and do it great." And so that's where I think the success came from. But again, it just blows my mind. Like, of this existed before. Why do you know work then, but work now? Kind of deal.
Well, it
Things of
was
that
it
sort.
was working, but I don't think it was able to. I don't know the exact reasons as to why the app shut down, but something had to take its place.
That's something we could cover in our maybe a podcast history of social media.
For sure.
Fine downfall. We could paint this story real good.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
What is your experience with social media been? I know you actually were kind of ahead of the game. Okay, I want to bring this up before I forget. So I actually, I'm suffering a little bit of buyer's remorse right now, but I ended up purchasing a Google Pixel because it is the only phone that you can load Graphene OS onto, which is
Interesting.
an operating system that is completely de-Googled. It
Me
has,
gusta.
yeah, it is probably the top open source privacy focused operating system right now. So I'm deciding to check it out, and it's not so much because I'm, a nut who's afraid of the government spying on me, but it's because I just love new operating systems and technology, and I do really like cybersecurity. So this is a new way of me getting further into that passion or hobby. I may get it and think it's terrible, but we'll see.
Right.
But that brings us to the point of, I know that you have been very careful, even since a decade ago, about what you share online. And I'd love to get your thoughts on that whole method or how that came about.
So it really came about because of I just will never forget that high school information session. It wasn't even a pep rally. High school information
I
session.
think I remember the one you're
All
talking about.
students gather in the gym. Our gym at our high school was very rickety. It was old. The benches were wooden that would sometimes open all the way out, sometimes would not. Have to be wary of pinching points everywhere. Lacquered on a wooden bench, metal that was very rickety, person in the front, no PowerPoint, just a microphone
Okay, I'm writing this for the
telling
novel.
us about social media and the dangers of it. And so this person would go into detail of like, oh, it's great to have Facebook. We've been interconnected more than ever. No poopy. And just so you know, FYI, employers will look up your name on Facebook and stalk you. Facebook stalk you wasn't coined a term at that time. Will look at your Facebook, and if there's any naughty content on there, they will possibly not hire you for the job. And my little impressionable self at 15, 16 years old was like, oh no, I want all the jobs. I don't want the employer to do this. And so then became the idea planted in my mind of anonymity, because we were also entering, in terms of United States history, we were coming clean off of the Patriot Act that was passed in the guise of,
Edward Snowden.
well, not Edward
Was
Snowden,
that the
in the
same
guise
time?
of the Iraq War with George Bush. We were going to go fight terrorism in every corner in every hemisphere. My God, we were trying to fight an idea. You can't kill an idea. Like, look at religion. Perfect example. Can't kill the idea, friend. Going back to the anonymity part, based off of that and that privacy, I knew more and more we live in a state or a country of, we profess that we have freedom and privacy, but in reality we don't. Because as soon as it comes up for security, that is thrown out. And myself, growing up in a conservative background, limited government and such, always pondered this and was like, I need anonymity because I don't know how my content will be used. I don't know what information will be shared. Because right now what's been happening is we've had this social media willingly us putting out content for governments, companies to use to market more stuff and consumerism to us at the very end. And it's bought and traded for by the highest bidder. And that's what's kind of, to bring it back, that's where it all started, was that conversation of fear of not getting employed. And that's where I came up with my pseudonyms, my pen names, and have really pushed that because of how it could be used and how it could be used against me and others, if that makes any sense.
That's pretty ahead of your time.
Yeah, and I always had, like, it was a selfish reason, but in reality it was kind of a good selfish reason because it kind of blocked me from the social media stuff. Now, granted, I still posted when I was younger in high school. That's what I will say is kind of nutty about Facebook memories, and every so once in a while you're like, memories for today, you're like, oh, 16 years ago this was said. And then there's sometimes a self-reflection of like, man, were we sad that day? Why were we sad? Or like, why were we happy this day? What were we trying to do? So it kind of adds that historical, like, what we were thinking journaling. And that's what I would say a good aspect of social media is you can look back on that because it never leaves. But at the same time, like, the dark side of it is that it can lead to this negative self-talk. It can lead to this comparison. And so I think by that, I just was so old fashioned and so of the old soul of like I want to talk to that person in person because that's to me more giving more dopamine than the online interaction, right? So does that answer your question? I know I went
It most
all
definitely
over the place.
does. I mean, you were onto something with the idea of talking to people in person because, well, and for anyone who's listening and doesn't know, I've been an esports coach for the past 3 years. So you understand I love video games and I love online interaction to a degree. And I never realized until I started to delve more into science based podcasts discussing the importance of human interaction and dynamics that there are certain neurochemicals and modulators that don't get activated when you have a conversation online. In the same way that having an AI girlfriend on your phone feels like you're talking to someone that's giving you butterflies, but you're not getting all of the there's a few comparisons you do the AI girlfriend. You could talk about how when you get likes on Instagram, it gives you a dopamine hit, but you're not getting the same. You're not getting a hug and you're not getting a congratulations in real life. You might get it via text, which is just ones and zeros. So everything is emulating those feelings and convincing your brain that that's what they are. But then the other interactions that take place in real life, the serotonin that's released when you like pet an animal or you hug someone, those aren't able to be activated because there's no receptors that are using them. So it got me to prioritize the social aspects of my life. And I think you really understood that from the get-go, because one of my bad habits is, since most of my work is online, I'll just be at my computer all day and I'll have no issue not talking to anyone for a while. I mean, there's obviously my mom and we have a good relationship and I'll talk to her every day. But as far as making an effort to go out and socialize, it wasn't at the top of my radar until I learned that when you don't socialize in person, it actually increases your risk for dementia and Alzheimer's. So
Really? Wow.
yeah, there's all sorts of stuff I could probably link you talking about this, but I thought, okay, this is not an issue of me being antisocial. This is actually going to cause me to deteriorate as a person if I'm not activating these switches in my brain. So things like going outside and getting physical activity and eating properly, that those aren't just things that people lecture at you because it's fun to, or it seems right, and then they don't do it themselves. There's actual practical advantages to doing each of those things that provide a real value in your life long term. So, and that's another thing too, we can discuss maybe on a different podcast, but all of the stuff that we're told to do but never explained why, I think actually getting the explanation is all the difference in the world. Like, it's just, why do
Dude,
I
we
need
could
to
do a
get 8
whole
hours of
series on
sleep?
that.
Oh,
Oh my god.
actually, because it raises your risk of heart disease and cancer, and it's the best performance enhancing drug that athletes don't take advantage of. Like, this
I
stuff
know
is
you've been
slept
on that
on.
sleep train for at least year two plus. I've been honestly myself been trying to implement that of like at the minimum going to bed at 10:30. At the minimum having a nighttime routine of
Yeah,
going to sleep. And that's where like and that's where I have these discussions with my friends about we threw out this institute of religion. Now, granted, there are some horrible things that religion has done to this world because they were encapsulated in government and you had those things, right? Minus that, because again, that argument can be applied to any sort of group of people. When you have a group of people together that's more than, I would say, at least three and sometimes low as two, there is corruption, right? There is going to be this element of maybe a little corruption or
interesting.
nepotism or whatnot.
That's a
That's
low
my
number.
that, well, because I was thinking about it as I was saying it, I was like, 10 people. I was like, but there's definitely been business partners who have stabbed each other in the back for money. So I was like, wait, I can't say just 10 because that's not being encapsulating. So that's why I went down to
Yeah,
two. Bringing it back.
fair point.
Uh, religion gave this structure, for better or for worse, a structure of routine. Routine, I think, is key for a lot. Now, last time we spoke in person when I was visiting for the holiday and Christmas, we were talking about routine, sleep, and things of that sort, and how that changed how you as a person interacted in the world and was doing well. But what happens when I need to go off routine to do something? Do I just simply don't do this activity for the sake of I need my sleep? And this is a key part of how I adapt, or do I just take that routine and adjust slightly and then just be tenacious and word please, I'm thinking of it, it's coming, it's the ADHD,
You,
tenacious in like overcoming this obstacle,
mhm.
and I'll bring it back down, being conscious of that. How do we do this? But to bring it back to the religion gave structure, and that's why prayer and things of that sort and how to shut down your day actually, I would say, contributed to longer living in a sense.
Gave a sense of purpose.
Purpose, yes, purpose and routine,
Yeah.
very key. But I don't know how you adjust your routine to then accommodate those things. Like, for instance, for me at work, sometimes I have to work after hours because that's when students meet, and I will just flex my hours, and that's a routine switch, right? But if I'm keeping the same ritual at the end of the day, will that still impact? I'm still experimenting with this to see, and as time goes on, maybe we'll bring it back up in the podcast. But when I'm changing this, it's actually not hurting me as much because I'm just a slight adjust. I'm still getting the hours needed, things of that sort. So I don't know if you have the answer to that question or not. What happens when I need to change my routine to accommodate or not?
So my strategy is by default. If I can keep everything as is, I will. Just say no to the things that are preventing you from maintaining your routine, because if you don't draw that line, there will always be a reason every single day to not stick to it, because we're busy. So if I can say no, if I can reschedule, I'll do that. And if it's absolutely necessary to follow through on that obligation at that specific time, then you just take the L. So maybe go to bed a little bit later, and then you have to either wake up at the same time if that's viable, or wake up a little bit later to accommodate, and then try not to make a habit of letting those things go through. You really have to be strict with your filters and say, I'm going to do this at this time. If someone wants to hang out or do something, I'm not available at that time. You just don't be available. It's as simple as that. And you don't have to have I shouldn't say a tremendously good reason. It is a good reason. If your health is your number one priority and you are unavailable for that reason, you shouldn't have to feel bad about it. Because I think that's where some of the problems come up is, oh, dude, why are you being so weird? Like, let's just go hang out. Let's go to the bar
the fear
real quick.
of missing out, maybe too.
True.
I think is at play as well.
Yeah.
And being comfortable with that. So it sounds like what I'm hearing, not to like curb the conversation from what you were saying or
how dare you?
Off. I know. Shame on me. Shame on my family. Shame on my house pets. Shame on the desk that I'm using currently.
Especially the house pets.
Especially to bring it back, it's being comfortable with what is a factor outside that is influence, or inside, right? So fear of loss, being comfortable that it's okay to have a loss, being comfortable with this is how I need to function, that's okay. It's incorporating that comfortableness and okayness with thyself and what you need to do to thrive. And as I've gotten older, people in your friend group or inner circles are not respecting that. It's time for you to part. And that's sometimes hard too, because it's like, well, this person's family, this person I've known for 9 years, this is someone I'm interested in as a significant other. But at the end of the day, who has to put themselves to sleep? Who has to live with themselves is you. And so
Amen.
any imparting wisdom to our listeners is that do it for you. Yes, it can be seemed as selfish, but it's how you, that's where it comes back to what we originally talked about at the beginning of our podcast, intent versus impact. That's what thing you can work on. The intent is I'm trying to take care of myself and can be seen, and the impact is being seen as selfish. And that's just a wisdom in working on those skills of like, hey, I need to actually not meet at that time because I need, this is when I do insert excuse this, or at that time I do this. I would feel more comfortable in expressing those healthy boundaries.
If you can afford to be completely honest, I would say do that, because you will, I mean, that in and of itself is a hell of a challenge. If you can say to someone's face, like, look, I really would like to spend time with you, but I'm not going to, or I can't because I actually want to go to sleep and get good sleep, versus, making up, oh, I'm busy with work or what have you. That will, I think that's almost the ultimate filter. Obviously, you can't be 100% honest with everyone, because you're going to hurt a lot of feelings, and things get misinterpreted. You have to account for misinterpretation. But if you can be as honest as possible, you're like an anomaly, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. I would add to the honesty, it's the honesty with the sense of care. It's where it's how you present. It's like, for instance, Rome, I need to do this for my health. That's going to be interpreted as, oh, direct person, not very kind, this and that.
Like, I'm responsible for taking you away from focusing on your health.
Yeah, right. Whereas, hey, Rome, I need to take this time to myself for mental health reasons or for whatever reason, but I'd still like to make this work. What's another thing we could do? And that's a little negotiation.
Solution oriented. You actually asked a question that would lead to a potentially desirable solution, whereas a lot of people leave it at, that's not going to work.
Because it's the collaborativeness, and I think it's a combination of how we're raised as individuals and how we are in the world of always having to constantly market ourselves for better, for worse, where it's like, it's a collaborative aspect. And that's like, it's not going to be something you turn on overnight. And that's one thing I talk with my students, is being okay with the uncomfortability of that aspect. Because one pushback I'll hear immediately is like, well, this gives me anxiety when I do that. Cool. Is this a anxiety, or is this like, this is uncomfortable? Because you have to also figure out, is this a discomfort, a true anxiety? Because I feel like
the term gets thrown around quite a bit.
That and trauma, right? For better or for worse, it's become a malleable word, and it's where it's like, is this a real trauma or is this an uncomfortability? And being uncomfortable does not mean we get to change the world to your uncomfortability. It means that you have to sit in it, and how can we better adjust and advocate for myself in a polite, caring way throughout the world. And so, like, hey, this makes me uncomfortable. No, and via that admission, it brings back to kind of like why the priest is sometimes a good priest, or the good therapist is a good therapist, is like, I'm advocating for myself, putting myself authentically out there. And the scary part is whether that's received or not. And in my experience, 90% of the time, there's always outliers, but 90% of the time in generals, that is respected and understood. And if it is not, again, bringing it back full circle, that person may not be the best for your person or your inner circle for life. And that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Obee Won, thank you so much for another really informative episode. I think these are getting better each time. It's just going to take just practice every day. And I think another lesson that listeners can take away is, if you are working on something, or if you're trying to build a habit or consistency, you're actually watching it unfold in real time, because, this is a new endeavor. Running a podcast is something that we've never tried before. And the key that I want to keep in mind at all times is that whether things turn out good or not, you still got to show up the next day and try it again and make adjustments based on the prior performance or the prior discussion, and review that and go forward from there. I think it's kind of the ultimate way of improving from a fundamental standpoint. So thank you for all of your insight. And was there anything you wanted to close with before I finish this up here?
I would say that love yourself, because you have yourself at the end of the day, and not to let negative self-talk fester when you don't accomplish something or when you're comparing yourself. Be kind to yourself. The world will consistently put things in place to do the latter, and it is in our like default sometimes to be in the negative, and all you can do is try. That, like Rome said previously for our close, was next day is the new day, and that's another opportunity to try these things out and be consistent about it. All it takes is 21 days, 3 weeks to form a new habit. And the key is, though, when you fail, and if you fail, because we're human, what do you do after? And to quote from a little bit of Batman Begins of Alfred, why do we fall, Bruce? So we can learn to pick ourselves back up. And being tenacious, that is what pushes you forward, is what do you do next? Do you fester and let that negative self-talk kick in? Because it's going to happen. Or do you refute and say, no, this is new day, new person, new Obee Won, new Rome. Let's do this. And so that's what I encourage you all to do, is new day, new habit. You've got this. Thank you all for listening. I think that's pretty much it. And we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Thank you so much, guys.